Cool. It is now recording. I'll be the host for this evening, and joining me are a few other design mentors on ADPList. We'll start out with some introductions and break into a few questions I've curated for us to discuss how to show the value of design. I've also reserved some time at the end for a Q&A, but please feel free to write your questions in the chat. I'll be writing them down throughout the conversation so we can bring them up at the very end. If you have a question for a very specific panelist, please be sure to include their name in the question. So with that, maybe we'll jump into some introductions. I'm Chris Yu. I'm a UX team lead at Arista Networks cybersecurity division. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a first generation Chinese American that started as an architect and pivoted into UX. Our first panelist is Eugene. Eugene, can you tell us a bit more about yourself?
Yeah, hello everyone. I'm currently the director of product design at MLSE. For those that don't know what MLSE is, we're the parent company for a majority of the Toronto sports teams. So Toronto Raptors, Toronto Maple Leafs. I work for an organization called Digital Lab, which is our sort of digital and technology arm for the organization. My main focus is around scaling product design teams with the focus on design ops and design strategy.
Cool. Thanks for the intro. Next, we have Julie. Julie, could you give us a brief intro of who you are and what you do?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name's Julie Mills. I'm a product designer at Smartsheet, which is an enterprise work management application. I've been there for roughly 3 years, working on a variety of different areas of the product, ranging from our enterprise admin experience to our core grid experience. And now I'm working on search, browse, and our home experiences. So kind of that main navigation elements. I'm out of the greater Northwest, just out of Seattle, and I use she, her pronouns.
Thank you. And lastly, we have Shawn. Shawn, could you please introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. Shawn Borsky. I am currently the Vice President of Design at NZXT. NZXT is a PC gaming manufacturer designer. So we're most well known for making PC cases and coolers, but we make a bunch of other stuff as well. I lead a fairly large organization, 3 main organizations: industrial design, creative, and interactive at NZXT. We're about a 45-person organization at the moment. And previous to this, I have a lot of background in the game industry. I was at Blizzard Entertainment for 5 years previously. And then I've also been in a number of different startups. I was in the Bay Area previous to working at Blizzard, working on most notably, I was at Hotel Tonight, a couple of other startups. And then previous to that, I ran a boutique agency out of Atlanta. We did all the normal suspects, applications, websites, as well as a lot of games on what I always refer to as hardcore mobile. So I've been in and around the game industry and startup industry. Yeah, happy to be here.
Great. Thank you for the introductions. I think we're now at 28 participants or 28 guests to come view. So I think we'll just dive straight into the questions. So this one's for Eugene. Let's just start off with a softball. Eugene, what is the value of design to you, and how does design benefit your organization?
Yeah, so I think, value is such a broad term here, right? I think it's multifaceted. The thing that comes top of mind for me is around alignment, right, and setting a vision. So oftentimes, stakeholders will come to the table with a lot of different ideas and their opinions about specific things. And what design allows you to do is take what's sort of intangible and subjective and turn it into something that is visual, that's more hands-on, that then people can sort of direct the conversation around. And I think that's a very, very powerful tool, especially within my organization. We do a lot of exploration and experimenting, and oftentimes you have a lot of stakeholders that aren't within the technology space that need to be part of that conversation. So it's sort of part, facilitating, part handholding, but also part vision setting. And I've seen a lot of value in that over the years for me.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you for that explanation. And thank you for qualifying what value means, because value is very vague, right? Value in a lot of ways is subjective. to all of the panelists, if you wanted to chime in, please feel free to like use the yellow hand, and you can chime in as well. Julie, Smartsheet is has a very mature design culture, I would say, or a fairly mature design culture. When working with stakeholders that understand design but will continue to prioritize velocity over quality, are there any tips that you use to help sway your stakeholders to prioritize quality?
Yeah, this is a tricky question, but essentially when I started to think about this, I think you can be in kind of two perspectives as a designer working with the partners. And one of them is you're kind of designing in your own world and you establish a vision, and then somehow it gets pared down to something that maybe isn't a quality experience and it's being shipped. I think you can also approach authority in your design role, and having authority that collaborates well and really closely with your stakeholders. So in my world, my stakeholders that are making these decisions are typically product management, additionally engineering. So if I view us as working together as a team as well as we can, then those decisions likely aren't going to happen as much like within a vacuum. If anything, we're working together on potentially scaling a design vision back, and we're working together on what that definition of quality means. And everybody should feel empowered and on board by that. Not only is the design team potentially making concessions, so might be engineering and so might be product. But essentially, we're working for a business that likely has to ship something. And so maybe it's not the entire large, visionary thing that you designed. Additionally with that, I think using a participatory methodology in collaborating with your stakeholders is super valuable. So if you're bringing in your product folks and your engineering folks in on your research efforts, they'll have more empathy for the problems that you're solving and the solutions that you're proposing. So when you do get to that point, down the process of having to maybe pare back the design for an MVP, there's just a bit more empathy, and you can think about your customers in mind as you're doing that.
I love that. I think what I heard a lot of was, if you are getting a lot of pushback on quality, your method is to collaborate even closer with your product and stakeholders to really define what that quality represents, right? Because quality, very similar to value, can be very subjective, and being able to define that with your team members can help both increase quality and increase speed. Thank you for sharing. Shawn, as a design leader, you're like the VP of design. When a designer struggles under your organization to push a design through, what are some actions that you can do as a design leader to help them?
Yeah, I think that this is a case where I might also, kind of like what Julie was talking about, twist the assumption a little bit on its head, which is that if a designer is trying to push a design through, then they're probably not approaching the collaboration with their partners the way that they should. I'm a big fan of using the term partner rather than stakeholder. Obviously, there are true stakeholders in many relationships, but often the idea is that like people treat each other like there's a power dynamic. And I think if a designer is trying to push through something, they haven't fully understood the shared goals that the team has. I feel like whenever you hear the word vision, I think kind of like what Eugene was talking about, you can shortcut it as like shared goals and kind of like an endpoint that everyone can see and either be excited about or understand that the business needs to deliver. So if I hear that a designer is trying to push something through or they can't get collaboration, I start asking questions first, like, who is this for? What does success look like? Are trademark questions that I use quite often. I usually also have the kind of like idea where I ask people, how have you talked to your peers about this? So if they're not getting movement on design, it's like, oh, if it's coming from a lead, have you talked to your fellow leads? If it's coming from a director, have you talked to your peer directors about what the shared goal is? And I've generally found that if you get aligned on your shared goals, kind of like what Julie was saying, like maybe the reason that the design is struggling to be pushed through is because it's not aligned to the goal of the timeline, or it's not easy to engineer or to craft. So it's one of those things where when you see yourself as part of a cross-functional team that has a shared goal, like one of the values in NZXT is win together. And that's something we push on pretty hard. And it's like I had a mentor. This is not like the most unique thing ever, but I've heard the idea that basically designers don't ship mockups, engineers don't ship code, and product people don't ship tickets. We all ship a product. So like I said, I would say it's kind of like one of those things where I don't know if a good metaphor, but if you've ever like been working on certain things and people will tell you like, hey, if you have to force it, you're probably not doing it correctly, right? And I think that's probably the same thing with most design situations that I'm aware of, is that if you're like, oh, I'm turning this, it's not really going very well, the option you have is to keep pushing harder, and it's probably going to break or not work, or you can recognize that maybe that's not the way that the process should be working. So that's kind of my approach to it. And I'd say in general, as a specific design leader, what I try very hard to do is when I see leaders moving from a position to a lower one, like involving themselves in day-to-day operations, I call it altitude shifting. A lot of my peers use that term as well. And it's not a good thing for vice presidents or directors to do because they lack a lot of context. So I try very hard, that I'm aware of a situation that's happening, to understand what cross-functional team is responsible. So is this happening at the what I would call the lead layer, a design manager? Is it happening at a director level? Or is it like cross-cutting different sides? And that also helps me understand what the coalition is I need to bring together in order to find out what the shared goal is, or whether or not we're aligned on it. I've actually seen some situations where, in doing some just investigation, not trying to solution, just asking questions, finding out what everyone's perspective is, that I was able to discover that we all had different ideas of what we were doing, even though the project was the same. This actually happens a lot on redesign projects, where it's like, oh yeah, we're doing a redesign, and one side is like, oh yeah, we're going to make it look better. The other side's no, we're redoing we're redoing the tech stack, or everyone's like, oh no, we're trying to fix the UX flows. And if everybody's got a different idea of what we're doing, that could lead to a design being pushed back against because it's not aligned to what that side of the team looks like. So my tools du jour are usually to go to specific leaders, ask them questions, understand context, and then bring them together either into shared spaces. So Slack chat, meeting, just bring everyone into the same room and be like, hey, let's get aligned on what we're doing. And you'd be surprised how often that fixes the problem, or at the very least helps everyone kind of say their piece. And you generally find out also that most people kind of make assumptions about things. If you've ever heard the term assume positive intent, well, it's easy to say that, but a lot of people fail to do it. They always make the assumption, oh, they don't understand what I'm trying to do, or they're trying to take credit for this or whatever. And most people, especially in design and engineering and product roles, most people are trying hard, and they've got their own way they're trying to approach it. And if you don't take the time to put yourself into their position and understand what their side is and how you're both going to contribute to the shared goal, then it leads to situations where y'all are trying to push each other instead of, work together, using my hand signals.
I love it. I love all the little nuggets of wisdom you had in there. Like, if you're pushing something, if you feel like you have to push something, you're probably doing it wrong. A metaphor that one of my developers used to tell me is, sometimes when you put your nose to the grindstone, you just end up with a missing nose, right? Like it doesn't always, hard work and gusto doesn't always fix all of the problems. So sometimes it's really just like getting people in the room, talking about it, and really aligning. And also, thank you for enlightening us on altitude shifting. That is not something that I've ever heard of, but it does make a lot of sense. The closest thing that I can think of altitude is the notorious swoop and poop, where an executive will come down and take a look at something and then poop all over it and then fly away. As an IC, I can speak to that and just say like, wow. And part of the way I try to mitigate that is trying to get everyone into the room before they come swooping down and like pooping on things. So yeah, it's really great to see it from the other perspective as well. Eugene, I think we all kind of agree that design is critical here, especially within sports and entertainment. But I think oftentimes it's difficult for business leaders to really understand the business impact of design. As a design leader, how do you help the rest of your organization measure the business impact of design?
Yeah, so I think, in this case, and just going back to, the conversation we had before this event, it's really trying to understand the needs and goals of the business in the first place, right? So as a director, you need to be able to talk the talk and understand where the opportunities are, and then align all your efforts and everything that you want to do around those sort of buckets that you've identified. And I think the clearer the connection you can make between like the business objectives and your objectives are and your team's objectives are, and the better you can communicate that out, the more the easier it is for the organization to see how you're contributing direct value. And I think oftentimes most teams don't spend enough time in the problem space to really define and understand what that connection looks like. And I think that's where a lot of the problems stem from, where you're running with either assumptions or sometimes you don't even go through that, and it's like a top-down initiative where you're getting told what to do. We've all been there, and we know how that sort of situation turns out. I think if you can sort of own the sort of communication and understanding really like how the business problem ties to your specific problem in the product that you're working on, that definitely helps in that scenario.
Yeah, that makes sense, because obviously whenever I'm asked, how do you measure the success of this? That's always subjective, right? Like an NPS is not going to solve everything, right? Shawn, you had something to say?
Yeah, no, I really like where Eugene was going with that. And I think what you were even just saying there, which is that I think a fairly large amount of teams actually tend to measure success as, did we finish it? And as we're probably all aware, for most businesses, that isn't really business value. It's execution. And one thing that's helped me as well, kind of like if you're trying to get into like, what does business value mean, air quotes, this is like a thing that I usually used to help break through the noise, which is like, when you get into all different types of business, it's very easy to complicate what a business case is. Like, people can throw graphs at you or a lot of financials. And what I always like, I kind of like find comforting, is I always go back to the very top of the business, which is, we got to make more money than we spend in order to be profitable. And then I can then back it off and say, okay, the thing that I'm working on, is the goal to generate revenue, or is the goal to save cost? Generally speaking, it's doing one of those two things. It's because at the end of the day, like I said, you can complicate all sorts of business objectives, but at the end of the day, the goal of a business really is to make more money than you spend. So it gives you some weird clarity in when all the noise is coming through around like, oh, this is what this is trying to do, and our customers, whatever. And I've really found that, and that also, of course, can show you that like executing a project doesn't really tell you whether it did either of those things. And that's why it's generally not a good goal for designers. And I think like what Eugene was saying, owning the communication, showing also that you are aware of this. Like, I think a lot of designers just don't have to think about it. They're just like, oh, I want to make it look good. And they have a nebulous idea that it will be good for the business because it looks good or feels better. But a story I used to always tell is being able to tie it directly to a metric, like, hey, we're delivering this thing and it's going to make the experience better. And we know that this experience causes people to call customer service when it's not working, which means that their time costs money. So I can very easily do some what I call bullshit math, which is like find some of the numbers and be like, hey, okay, so let's take, for instance, the amount of hours it takes for a CS person to answer a call. Let's figure out how much they get paid hourly. So we can figure out how much it actually costs the money to have a bad experience. And then we can say, okay, and if I provide X, Y, Z, I believe I can reduce it by X percent, and then you can draw the bullshit math all the way to, and it will save the company this much money. That was actually a technique I used when working on the authenticator for Blizzard. Is a project that no one wanted to fund because people are like, oh yeah, we want people to feel secure. But as soon as we were able to say, hey, yeah, if we reduce the CS contacts on logging in by 10%, we'll save the company $9 million. And at the scale of Blizzard, all of a sudden, all the other businesses are like, $9 million saves. How much does it save? And then also being able to prove that out. Like, even though the math was kind of bullshit, like I said, we made a bunch of assumptions just by connecting the logical numbers. Once we knew, like, okay, that's what success looks like, so we have to track it. So when they let us do all the design work that we wanted to do when we put out the app and then we tracked it, we actually ended up saving the company like 15 million or something. But it ultimately came down to, we got so much more backing because the previous team that before I had taken over tried to get it greenlit, and they were trying to sell it on, oh, it's going to make people feel more secure. And the business just couldn't put a value to what that meant. But as soon as we were like, yeah, we're going to save money on CS contacts, it worked really well. So that, to me, those are kind of, sometimes it's good to just break out of the noise of everything and just be like, business is actually quite simple when you really get down to it. Obviously it's not simple, but it sometimes helps a lot to think that way.
I love it. I love bullshit math because I'm not good at real math too. And sometimes I feel like as UX designers, I think we can all relate that we can also do armchair research where you just kind of like Google a few things and you're like, yeah, that makes sense. I think that's now researched, done. I love it. Julie, I have another question for you. There are times when business decisions just roll down to designers at the IC level, and we just simply don't have the positional authority to challenge them. What do you do when you have a business decision that impacts the design that you disagree with?
Totally. Well, first of all, I think it's important to understand the business. Similarly to what Shawn and Eugene said, like a lot of decisions are made outside of what is UX craft. Most decisions are made outside of what is UX craft, and it has to tie back to the business in some sort of valuable way, which often has to do with money or customer retention or customer acquisition, et cetera. So the more you can understand how the business you're working for, the company you're working for operates, I think the less you'll take these types of scenarios as personal. I also think it's super important to have empathy for your partners who have to tell you this type of stuff. Because their world is a lot different than ours, and we're each in our roles for specific reasons. But it's super important to understand, maybe why your PM is, coming to you and kind of telling you what to do on behalf of the business, maybe for a financial element. Maybe it's from a tech debt perspective on the engineering side. But ultimately having empathy and then figuring out how to be a partner. And that goes within figuring out if this is something you're going to dig your heels in, if it's actually a problem, or if it's something that, you just need to think creatively and get on board with your partners and figure out what the best option is from an experience perspective that can still align with these business goals. So you can ask yourself, like, is it a one-way door? Is it a two-way door? Change to the experience. Will this change potentially make this better than it was before? Like, can we learn something from it actually? Those are the questions that I would be asking myself. What's released today? Is the change that we're proposing going to harm people? Or, is it just maybe not as ideal? But are we going to learn something? Can we commit to learning something and then, iterating and improving? So again, I think there's no right or wrong answer. You kind of have to get in there and figure out what makes sense. But additionally, with that, I think as you're designing experiences, and obviously this makes sense on some projects and not on others, but if you have the opportunity to define a vision that within your product area that is, 1 to 2 years out, that's kind of, I think what maybe Shawn had mentioned earlier, that's like the goals the shared goals that everybody is on board with. So if there is something like that you can hold on to as these decisions come down, I think that can be a good way to help make decisions and solve those problems. Because if everybody has that shared understanding of that vision and they've all been bought on, then we're, choosing to make decisions that are either in line with this decision, with this vision, or not in line with this vision. And let's be conscious about that.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that's kind of like the theme of tonight's talk, is just collaboration and really understanding the business. So for designers, it's actually really important to not only understand the craft of the design, but also to understand what's paying the checks, right? Like, how are you getting paid? Because advocating for design is such I think a unique skill that I wouldn't necessarily anticipate like an entry-level person to have developed through some sort of boot camp or some sort of university program. I guess I wonder, as you all are hiring for mid-level designers or senior level designers, how do you test to make sure that someone is able to actually understand the value that they bring to an organization or the value of design? How do you know they get it? Because it's such a nuanced thing that involves collaboration, that involves understanding the business. I think maybe this question is geared towards like all of the panelists, but perhaps we can start with Eugene, and then feel free to raise your hand as things come to you guys.
Yeah, absolutely. What I look for generally is mainly around how well their case study sort of tells a narrative, right? So, at the beginning, are they able to clearly articulate what problem they're trying to solve and how it's going to drive some sort of impact to the business? And then as they're going through, their process and the journey of trying to figure this out, and post-launch, what impact it actually drove at the end of the day. So similar to what Shawn was talking about earlier, it shouldn't just end at delivery. There should be some sort of measuring and tracking after the fact to understand if you actually solve the problem or not. And I think being able to clearly articulate that whole journey and then tie the sort of impact back to what you're trying to solve in the first place is a very clean way to close the loop, and really sort of completes the case study for me. That's also one of the reasons why I suggest staying away from like hypothetical projects. It's difficult to talk about the impact when you don't actually launch the thing, or it's purely hypothetical.
Yeah, Shawn.
I think going to the same path that Eugene was talking about, I think I mentioned before, like designers that are, I think, a bit more immature don't tend to see design as a problem-solving discipline. They see it as maybe a visual one, or like they're only accountable for delivering their piece. So I definitely agree that when I'm looking at, say, portfolios and case studies, I also am looking for, hey, have you articulated what problem you were trying to solve, and how well did your design, how well did they actually execute on that? I would say when I was doing like boutique stuff, like when I was running an agency, the thing that always drove my success is that I really try to be like, okay, this small business is coming to me and spending $5,000 on a website, which is not necessarily a lot for a website, but it's a lot for a small business owner. What makes them feel that they're glad they spent like what is a lot of money with my firm? And it has to always come back to, did it actually achieve goals for them? Like, did they get ROI out of it? And I think when I'm looking at like senior designers and interviewing, I always say that like seniority is more of a mark of your ability to deal with ambiguity than it is like what I would call taste or your technical skill. And so when I look at the ability to deal with ambiguity, which is that I can hand you a giant pile of problem as a designer, and then you don't need me to hold your hands to help you work through it. And I think that means that that the designer has to have this flexible understanding of the constraints of what they're working on. They can't just think about how am I going to make a design. They have to be like, what platform is it on? What's the business trying to solve? How much time do I have? What technologies are there? Like, and so it requires a much more holistic sense of what design means. You see it as problem solving rather than creating visual mock-ups or delivering those or throwing them over the wall to a team. And I think that's where like some people get caught up in the execution mindset of like, oh, I just have to focus on showing that I can ship things. And I think that's kind of table stakes at this point. Like you would assume that most people could deliver a set of mockups or artifacts and whatever, but there's no true value in that. So I think, again, like really being able to, when people come to me and they're able to like articulate, especially when you ask them about what they've done at other companies, and if they just talk about things that they've designed or like, oh, I delivered these things. And to Eugene's point, I think like theoretical or unsolicited design projects might be okay if you're a junior designer and just trying to show you have technical skill. But if you're any kind of seniority and you show me that and you don't show that you recognize that your job is not just to take someone else's design that you didn't think looked good and then reorganize it, like all those ones that are like, oh, I redesigned Facebook, thereby demonstrating that you were not able to understand any of the problems that Facebook is trying to solve with that design, even though it does potentially look better. So I think that's right on in terms of, now how you pick it out obviously is like how people talk. Like I'm a big fan of like open-ended interviewing where I don't come equipped with like a question that has the right answer. I just ask questions and see how people work through the problem. So I'm just like, hey, how would you approach this thing? Or, you know, tell me about a time when you felt this. And you kind of just listen to how they talk about their own work. And if they talk about it holistically as part of a team and they talk about the constraints, I'm like, okay, this person's senior. They understand that they're always part of a team. They're never just a designer. Whereas if people start talking about what they did and how they design this, and especially if they start throwing their other functions under the bus, like, oh, I delivered this amazing thing, but then we couldn't actually engineer it and blah, blah, blah. That tends to be a red flag for me. So definitely agree with the path that Eugene was talking about there.
Yeah, that makes sense. Julie, how about some of the hiring loops that you've been included in?
Yeah, I was just thinking about some of those loops that I've been on in the last 6 months. And I think, you know, when we're looking for like a mid-level designer versus a senior level designer or higher than that, you know, there is a big difference kind of in those presentations. Just the communication aspect and tying design back to clear goals and the business is typically seen kind of in those more senior level and higher candidates. So maybe it's might not be expected as much of someone that's junior or mid-level, but I still think it's good for those folks to start thinking in that mindset and you know, think about the goals that you're trying to achieve at the beginning of the project as well, and following through at the end and making that a part of the narrative. But yeah, there is a definite difference, and there's a reason, you know, why you hire a senior designer at certain points, maybe versus mid-level, is there's just a different level of responsibility and ownership, and maybe strategic impact, you know, that they're contributing on the projects that they're working on.
Definitely.
It's been fun to observe. Actually, I'm like sitting on those and get really impressed. So it's inspiring for sure.
When Shawn had asked me, or when Shawn had said table stakes, it just makes me think of how many times stakes are referenced in business, like stakeholders, like people that are literally holding stakes and table. It just makes me feel like we're all like slaying vampires to some degree. Like everyone's just kind of holding it, waiting to like jam it into your heart if you fail. Thank you again so much for all the explanations on just talking through the hiring process, how you're vetting candidates in terms of this very specific competency. Let's see, we got a question from Jasmine on whether the speakers could expand more on what are considered red flags at an interview. So maybe Shawn, if you could start, and Eugene, we'll go Shawn, Eugene, Julie.
Sure. I think it, I mean, obviously it does depend a little bit on the level, but I mean, for me, what I'm looking for in most any design candidate is, I don't want to say like a level of being humble, but I tend to kind of evaluate whether or not someone feels that design is just there to like give it directions. Like if they see other functions as just executing their work versus being a partner. And you can generally hear it in how people talk about their work. Like I said, if they use a lot of the "I did this," that tends to be a bit of a red flag where people are trying to take credit for something. I feel like especially as you go up in leadership, that becomes a bigger and bigger red flag. Because in my mind, especially within leadership, at least the way that I run a lot of my teams, and I think healthy organizations work, is that leaders are there to make a safe environment for their team and to push responsibility and empowerment and basically take the blame when things go wrong and give credit when things go well. You're a tank in order to protect your team so that they feel to do their best work. So when you're talking to people that are very interested in credit or talking about what they did and trying to prove to you that they did something well, and that, you know, I had a couple interviews at Blizzard where people would basically be like, oh yeah, I'm going to make engineering my bitch and stuff like that. And of course, like everyone in the interview panels, like that's like a crimson flag. Like that's not how any good design operates, right? But like some people do have those kind of opinions. And I think the other thing is, I would say, again, this thing I was alluding to before, if people are characterizing design as a visual type of medium where they're interested in, they're using the word beautiful a lot and saying how it looks great, and especially if they're throwing other functions under the bus, like and not necessarily like, oh, they ruined my design, but like, hey, I wanted to do blank and I couldn't because reasons or because business, like if they're blaming the business for not properly executing something that they did, I tend to look at that kind of as a red flag, that maybe they don't understand that they're part of a team always and that they play a role, rather than, you know, a painter or magician that just tells people how to make a magical thing, or that they think that they're only responsible for artifacts, right? If they really focus too much on that. So sorry.
Thank you for explaining. Eugene, did you have any other thoughts? Or Eugene or Julie, I guess?
Yeah, I would say similarly to like, you know, being humbled. I think a huge red flag is like just people coming in with huge egos. In the sports and entertainment space, there are a lot of big characters and big egos, and in my team, I try to stay away from those. There's this really funny story. I don't know how true it is. It did not happen on my team, but apparently one guy came in for an interview for a role before my time, and he came in a Celtics jersey to you know, an organization that owns the Raptors, and the ego and the balls on this guy must have been insane to be able to try to pull that off. And I have no idea what the intent was there, but you know, like that kind of stuff, I think there's no place for that. And quite frankly, you don't want your team to waste energy when it comes to dealing with that kind of dynamic, right? You know, I would say my organization and the way that I like to operate, like we're as egoless as we can probably be, and there's a like a positive sort of vibe and energy that your team has because of it. And yeah, it's just one of those things that I always look for right off the bat.
Cool, thank you. Julie, if you have anything to add, otherwise we can move on to another question.
Nothing different than what's been said.
Sure. I think another question is kind of like the flip of this, which is what makes like a mid-level candidate shine, I guess? What qualities really make someone stand out from the pack as opposed to red flags, I guess? White flags?
Green?
Yeah, green flags probably.
Green flags, yes. Green flags.
I agree with Julie there. Yeah.
So I mean, I guess I can go first. So what makes a mid-level designer stand out, maybe as opposed to someone who's junior? If you're coming in as a mid-level designer, I imagine that You can tell stories pretty well. That's something that you're going to be doing in your job and on a regular basis, and what the business is, and specifically what the design side of the business is going to expect from you, to be able to go communicate rationale, value, storytelling of your customer base and research that you've conducted. So I'd say that's one of the biggest things, in addition to being able to run a UX process, depending on the role that you're looking for, whether that requires having to know research at all, or maybe not, seeing that you can run an end-to-end UX process, and not only is it just you're, like we've talked a lot about, you're working in collaboration with PMs and engineers and maybe other roles, but those are the two that I interface with daily. So, being able to share about your experiences with that and challenges, because I've never worked on a perfect project, or I don't even know what that means. We're all just here to deliver meaningful and valuable experiences. So being able to share maybe some of the constraints or the challenges that you had on the specific project, or challenges with the business or challenges with stakeholders, to show that just the breadth of some breadth of that work that you're taking on.
Eugene, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think Julie covered a lot in terms of the technical side, and again, what I would consider table stakes. I think for like an intermediate type role, and I think this kind of applies to more junior roles as well. One of the things I'm looking for from like a character and fit perspective is more so around like proactiveness, right? I think oftentimes I find that more junior folks kind of wait to be told what to do. And what I'm looking for in particular is, do they understand that, maybe as a junior, you're not coming in necessarily to make the most money, right? You're starting off as a junior. What you're there for is to gather experience, learn and grow and progress in your career. And are you leveraging that opportunity as much as possible, right? Or are you just kind of waiting to be told what to do all the time? And you can tell there's a clear delineation between folks that are like proactive and they kind of have that built in, rather than, folks that are a bit more sort of nonchalant and a bit more sort of laid back on that side of things. And you can also tell in folks like career trajectories on who's more proactive on that side.
That makes sense. Shawn, anything to add to that?
Yeah, to build on the proactivity, I agree with that. I also, in that same vein, I tend to look for what I would call curiosity and attitude. So like I kind of have the general opinion. So you're obviously looking for some level or understanding of design fundamentals as table stakes, and assuming they have that, it's kind of like one of my phrases that I use a lot is like, giving a shit is a strategic advantage. So showing that you really care about the quality and intentionality of the design work you're doing and how it impacts the customers, that to me is a really good sign for a mid designer. Usually that goes hand in hand with proactivity. They're not waiting to be told what to do. They're interested in what problems we're solving. They're always trying to find more resources to get better. They recognize where they are in their career. I think that's probably one of the key things, is showing, maybe it's not quite humbleness, but it is pretty common for people to apply to roles that they're not necessarily qualified for, which I don't think should stop people. I think you're always basically taking on a role that you're not ready for. But being able to be humble enough and self-aware to recognize that that's where you are and you want to grow, you want opportunity, you want to learn, you care about the quality of your work and getting better, and displaying that as a very kind of like outward attitude. I would say that's what would cause someone that's in the mid-level to stand out. Because like, I mean, ultimately, again, like I said, for me, the difference is how well do you handle ambiguity as you move up in your design career. If you make the assumption that you want everyone to have solid command of design fundamentals, clear taste, and being able to see what good looks like, but if you have people that want to learn and they're constantly looking at and trying to understand what better design artifacts look like, they care about the quality, that's a person that you can teach, and it's a person that is going to grow very quickly if they're given the right opportunities. And they'll find the opportunities as well. So to me, it's like, yeah, that's the kind of person I want on my team, because like I don't have to pull it out of them, right? I just have to open the door and let them run through it. So
I love that. I love the phrase giving a shit, because I think oftentimes when there's like when you're applying, you're going through the act of actually applying for a role. There's always like, resume, portfolio, optional, cover letter. And I don't know how many times I've like seen people submit an application without a cover letter. I recently hired a role on my team, and I had something about like 600 applicants. And of the 600 applicants, there were maybe 10 to 15 people that actually submitted a cover letter. And of the 10 to 15 people that submitted a cover letter, like 3 were actually curated towards like my team in business. And when we had someone go through to the end of the interview, they were interviewing with our CEO, and I had asked the CEO for feedback on the candidate, like what made them stand out to you. And very similar to Eugene's comment about personality and ego, a lot of it was they did their homework. They knew exactly what we did as a business. Of all the other candidates that made it to the final round, no one else understood what we were and what we did. So I think giving a shit is like a very, very important thing to have in a candidate. That's someone that's eager to learn, someone that is proactive. I think we had a question on how do you show proactiveness. I would say doing something when it's unprompted is kind of by definition being proactive, right? So assuming more responsibility than is asked of you. There's a saying.
I also have a side story about give a shit, by the way, but I don't want to cut you off though.
Okay, sure. I was just gonna wrap up with the saying that we have at Arista is like, if you look around the room and you're wondering who's supposed to do this specific task, the answer is you. Please.
Yeah,
go ahead,
I have one thing on the proactivity piece though. I think it goes back to Shawn's point about owning ambiguity. So even though owning ambiguity is most of my role, like it's still scary every time. And that's like the role that we take on as designers, and have that vulnerability, to go figure stuff out. Who's involved? What are we solving? What matters? What discrepancies are there between our partners and our stakeholders? And being proactive is owning that. Like, that's not design work, that's not designing in Figma or sketching. So I would say being proactive is owning that ambiguous side as well, as doing proactive design explorations and doing your due diligence there. That's actually probably the bigger piece of the time that it takes in my role. That's probably 70% of my job.
Yeah, absolutely agreed. Shawn, you had a story for giving a shit. I always love stories for giving shits.
So it is related to what we're talking about. So it's a good meld there. But so one of our official company values in NZXT is give a shit, and there was like a lot of discussion, especially because we don't allow like profanity in our Discord servers along with our community and stuff like that. And we had discussions as to like, well, everyone, like when you say it, it really feels raw, right? It feels right. And it was one of those things where when we were discussing like, well, when we put on the website, should we be like, oh, people, it's you care, or we care about quality. And we kept coming back to, no, we're not actually being real about what it is. And I remember it goes back to actually to build on what Julie was saying, which is that the idea of proactivity, it actually comes from care. Like, designers by kind of trade are much more empathetic than usually other disciplines. It means like that you actually like legitimately care about the experience that your customer is having. And that like all of the work you're doing is very intentional toward that. And the part that I remember in the discussion we were having as to whether or not to actually use give a shit as a company value that we put in front of partners, we put on our website, we put on decks, was that it gives you energy. Like, as whether or not you're a designer or anyone at the company, but seeing our customers have a good experience gives you energy. And that's why you do the thing that you do well. That's why you put the effort in. That's why you take on problems and become proactive, even if it may not be your job. Because at the end of the day, we're all here to do that. And that's what gives you energy, is to actually see our customers have their needs, wants, and desires fulfilled as they interact with the company in that way. And I just remember like, there was no other words that actually like authentically delivered the message. I actually care about what my customers want and feel, and it means that I'm going to put extra effort into that. And so we ended up being like, we got to be real with it. We can't say it like a, you know, we can't tone it down. We can't say it more politically correctly. And so far, every time we re-talk about our values, because it's something we constantly evaluate, that one is always the top of the list of people resonate with it. They use it in normal parlance. We talk about it with our customers within our own communities and stuff. And so anyway, I think it goes along with that proactivity message as well. It's about like, even like kind of what Julie said, even you're doing stuff that isn't really design, you're showing your other team members that you care about the outcome of what the team does, that you care. And that's like, and there's so many people that don't actually care about what they do. And I think we have a kind of like I would say a very unique opportunity, if you will, somewhat of a blessing to be in a career field where it's very easy to find that energy, because what you do, even if it's small, even if it's like, I mean, I briefly in my startup career worked for a company called Legal Reach. We made a social network for attorneys. Not a very engaging, fun subject. And yet by aligning with, I care about making attorneys' lives easier, and that's what we're trying to do, I could still get the energy. I could still give a shit about that, even though the topic itself was quite boring. And so I feel like designers have a unique ability to find that in everything we do. So like, I know to me, it's like one of the most important things. And to your point with cover letters and resumes, like when it's just very clear that people have just fired out their resume and they don't care about working with you on your problem, it's just harder to get excited about them joining your team. Whereas if they show you that they did their homework because they want to chase the same mission and goals that you do, and they get energy from doing it well, you're like, yeah, bring that person onto my team. So I know it's such an important point. It seems so easy, like, oh yeah, just care about your job, how hard? But I mean, I think it really does help a lot.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you for sharing that. I think we maybe have time for one more question. We had a question earlier about how do you collaborate with stakeholders on a product that doesn't have a lot of data available for it? So you're working on a new product. You don't really have a method to get telemetry or to have metrics to sway your partners. How do you advocate for design in the absence of metrics?
Yeah, I can talk about this one a little bit. I think even if you don't necessarily have like a benchmark, for instance, there's research that you can do and some legwork that you can do to help sort of build confidence in what you're going to pitch, right, to your stakeholders. And I think, you know, your ability on how well you do that legwork and upfront, I'm gonna call this like discovery work, will allow you to have the confidence to pitch a really strong vision or story to them that will then ultimately convince them at the end of the day. And I think part of it is, and this is something that we do actually quite a lot of in the R&D stream of things, where it's a lot of vision setting more than anything else, actually. And it's not just about data at the end of the day. It's, you know, especially in emerging technologies where a lot of the use cases haven't been clearly defined yet. It's still all very much being figured out as it's evolving. And I feel a lot of the emerging technology is just scratching the surface. So we also know that like we're trying to help define what those use cases can be. And we generally do it in almost like an experimentation format where, okay, we might not necessarily build a whole product out of this thing, but how do we come up with the hypotheses and test it out and validate it with them so that we can get some confidence and make a go, no-go decision around whether we want to move forward with this or not. And I think that approach has worked fairly well for us.
Thanks for expanding on that. We do have about 5 more minutes. Are there any other questions that you guys might have for our brilliant panelists? let's see. So we have a question. How do you stand out when applying? I hear it's a huge numbers game. I guess I can start with this one because a lot of the mentees that come to me, and maybe that also kind of speaks to the type of people that attend this event, have this mindset of the spray and pray, right? Like you kind of shotgun out your applications and then you pray that one of them goes through, because the mindset or the theme they use is, I don't need to get every job, I just need to get one job, right? But I find that very similar to the give a shit value that Shawn was describing. Typically, if you are spraying out and using the numbers to your advantage, the quality of what you're doing as a submission is actually lower overall, or it's very generic overall. And if you are trying to raise the quality of those applications, then it becomes so emotionally fatiguing to be able to craft such like curated cover letters, such curated portfolios, and such curated correspondence. So I don't think it's just a numbers game, but what are your thoughts, folks?
Yeah, I think it's, I'm not going to say it's not the numbers game because it is in my opinion, at least from people that I have talked to, like they've had to apply. And I'm talking about getting your foot into the door within UX. I'm not talking about, already having a career and maybe moving on to your next UX role, but especially on that kind of that entry level role. Unfortunately, it's hard to get your foot in the door, and a lot of people that I speak with are having to think about, how do I scale myself to get this, to get a job. So maybe I don't have to go back to an old industry or, pick up a bridge job. Like that's a reality that a lot of people are facing. So I do totally empathize with that. I think what I would say is, back to Chris's, and other folks on the panel's point of, adding that extra touch or extra flair. Like what are the systems that you can put in place for if you are applying to a lot of jobs to, make your cover letters still customizable, but knowing that, you're delivering a lot of these. So, are there have you created a template for yourself? But, within that, go and do your due diligence and understand this company and be actually interested. And I think that will also speak in your cover letter. But, I won't deny that, it, especially for the first, get time to get into UX, it can be demanding from a numbers perspective. So I think the question to ask yourself is like, how can I bring in quality, into this maybe heavily quantitative process?
I think one way to look at this, and this is advice that I give to a lot of mentees, is, oftentimes I think people forget like what it's like for a hiring manager and understanding that process as well. So, what I sort of tell the mentees is, I see a lot of that sort of like white minimalist, oh, hi, I'm a product designer from whatever, you'll see like a profile picture and then like just a one page of everything. Like I say that hundreds and hundreds of times, every single role that I post for. And one of the easiest ways to stick out is to just visually try something different, right? Going back to this idea of like you caring or you giving a shit. It's this idea that, are you just taking like a Wix template and mocking something up in a day, or are you actually spending time to really develop out your personal brand and your visual styling and that kind of thing too? And it shows at the end of the day, and especially if you can do something that is unique to you and talks a little bit about your personality, it definitely sticks out miles and above beyond most portfolios these days.
Yeah, just to reinforce what Eugene's saying, I agree, especially like this idea of putting yourself in the shoes of the hiring manager and really trying to understand how many applications they're going through. And he's totally right. The whole like, I'm a blank designer with the whatever, you see it like it's so shockingly common. And it's like when we were talking about like in the side chat, like around storytelling, like telling a little bit about your own story. But I do think that people need to be aware that like when you're firing a bunch of stuff against the wall and seeing what sticks, hiring managers can usually tell. Like, so even for me, like, yeah, develop out a template for your cover letter, but I would always alter it to visually speak to the company I'm applying to, like their design aesthetic. And also parts of the template were designs that I could slip in, portions where I could speak to, like, do my research and look at what the company is looking for and really speak to their mission. And I think going back to the hiring manager thing, like really put yourself in, like, I know like a lot of times a lot of people just kind of like, oh yeah, I seem qualified for that, I hit all the boxes, but really trying to read between the lines on the job description and try to understand what does the hiring manager need this person to do with the company, and making sure that your application demonstrates that the skill set that they're looking for. I often tell people that like my order of operations is almost always portfolio, cover letter, resume. So if your portfolio doesn't demonstrate the level of skill or the experience level that you're applying for, or it doesn't demonstrate the type of work, like perhaps not surprisingly, have a lot of mentees asking about getting into the game industry. And it seems fairly obvious, but having a portfolio that demonstrates that you care about games is a really good way to help yourself get into the game industry. And a lot of people will show me a portfolio with, you know, fintech and what kind of things. And I understand that that's the experience they have. So I always try to coach them on, and this is the case where I was mentioning with what I said, with what Eugene said before, where don't make up fake projects, but also maybe try to do things that demonstrate that you care about that, and then really show though that you understand that you don't have enough context to properly design this, but show that you're interested. And it could be as simple as what Eugene's saying is, instead of being like, I'm a product designer, saying like, I'm really jazzed about doing blank, and I'm really excited to be applying for this. And that's why I always go portfolio cover letter, because I can learn a lot more about you from the way that you introduce yourself and the way you display your work than what jobs you've had. And sometimes just putting a little bit of extra oomph where all those things look the same, like you actually spent effort to make them feel related. To Eugene's point, sometimes that really stands out, because a lot of people just put in like a white page with whatever. And I understand that it takes a lot of effort, but you know, for the hiring manager, this is the job they need to hire. They don't really empathize with your position that you're applying to a bunch of jobs. They only care about what they need to do. So I think really putting yourself in the, hey, I'm a hiring manager, I've got like a minute to look at this application. What is going to stand out to me? What are the takeaways that I get about this person? And if I get a little bit of your personality, I'm able to see that you understand what skill sets I'm looking for, and you've shown it to me in your portfolio. I'm like, yeah, let's bring this person in. They clearly are interested in my goals as well as their own, right? So yeah,
absolutely. Well, thank you everyone for joining this chat tonight. Hopefully you have found a lot of value in this, whatever value means to you. Thank you everyone for, again, spending your Saturday evening with these group of people and dedicating your time to giving back to the community. So thanks everyone once again. And again, this session is recorded, so I will post this somewhere. I think ADPList has a YouTube. You'll probably find it there.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks y'all. Have a good weekend.
You too.